You take the S, there was an S behind the D, you take that out, and that farm had been in the family, in the Bildfell family since the late 1500s, as far as it's been tracked back, and it was consistently owned by the family until my great-grandfather immigrated to Canada in 1877. Our grandmother had died in 1875, so he, at that point in time, sold the farm and all his belongings, and with 6 kids came to Canada. He was noted to be a very successful farmer, and for 22 years he'd been the parish administrator, which would be sort of like a mayor or a reeve or something like that. So he was also he was a paid employee of the government at the same time as farming. So when he came, he wasn't like the traditional, immigrant with $10 in his pocket. I think he had a little more than that, because when he got to the Lake Country by Winnipeg, he was able to build a house right away and start farming. So on the other side of the coin, my mother's family had absolutely nothing when they came. Mom was in her 3rd year and her sister was a year old, and they literally rode in the bottom of a cattle boat from Reykjavik to Halifax, and then by train, and you can imagine what the trains were like, from Halifax to Shoal Lake in Manitoba. So that's how we kind of got here. Then they moved to, my grandfather sold out his farm in Thingvalla in Manitoba, and joined my grandfather, and when they moved from Churchbridge to the Foam Lake area where we lived. And it's you can't really imagine what those people went through. That was a foot journey from Churchbridge to Foam Lake. There were 5 Icelandic families that were basically the original settlers in that area. So they drove their cattle and walked from Churchbridge to Foam Lake. And when my mom and her family came, by that time the railroad had got down to Shio, which was about 15-20 miles away. So they had a much shorter walk to get to the town. And some of the stories that were told about my grandfather, Geesley, when this was going on, he was the go-to guy, sort of a thing. He was the first chairman they started, the Icelanders there started the first school. My grandfather was the first chairman of the school board there. He was also the postman. He would make non-stop trips from Foam Lake to Yorkton by horseback, and he had a routine that he'd ride the horse for a certain, and he had this measured out, timed out. He'd ride the horse for a certain distance, then he'd get off and run and lead the horse, and then when his turn was up, then he'd get back on the horse. And these were non-stop trips. Like Yorkton, there were no roads as such, so this was really across virgin country. And he made that trip many, many times. As a matter of fact, one trip he made all the way from Foam Lake to Saltcoats, because he got to Yorkton and he was looking for a part for a mower, and they didn't have it there, so he had to carry on up to Saltcoats. And those trips we were told, were non-stop trips. He was also the mailman, and when on one of his trips, he I guess fell asleep and fell off the horse and damaged the knee so badly that he was permanently crippled in one leg for the rest of his life. So you can imagine when they got out there was no doctors, no nurses, no nothing. The first building they got out, they built for the 5 families, they built one huge building, and that's what they lived in for the first 2 winters, and the livestock this housed the livestock as well as the people. And the reason for that, of course, if you go into the Baltic countries, this is a very common thing, because they use the heat from the animals during the wintertime. It's to help keep warm. So Dad and Mom got married in 1915, and so these kids know how these names come about. John's name is actually Augmundur Jon, and he's named basically after Grandpa's brothers, Augmundur and Jon, who lived in Winnipeg, and they were both quite successful people in Winnipeg. The six that came over, three of them died shortly after they got here, and then the other three, our grandfather and two others, carried on from there. And so our oldest brother's name is Geesley, so he was named after my grandfather. My next oldest brother's name was Torfy, so he was named after my mother's grandfather, my mother's father, and so on down the line. And then when we got to us, they were run out of Icelandic names, so we got the leftovers. John, of course, was born in 1922, and that just at the beginning of what was known as the Roaring Twenties. And the Great War was just over, and the effects of the Spanish flu were finally winding down, and people were suddenly thinking they could live again. It didn't last very long. It only lasted 7 years. Till the market crash, and then the Depression, and so on. And so Sharon wanted the kids to have a feeling of what it was like when John was growing up. Well, of course, we had no electricity, no running water, outdoor toilets. We slept on mattresses. My memories are more recent than John's, but I don't think they're going to be a lot different, because we were, until the war started, we weren't a very well-to-do family, other than we had lots of food out at the farm, and we didn't want for anything. But just the little things that come back in my mind is spinning the cream separator. From about the age of 5 on, you started to get your chores, and the younger ones looked after Mom's stuff, brought in the wood, carried the water in, gathered the eggs, did all those sorts of things. And then as you progressed, and you got up to where you're cleaning the barn and milking the cows and learning to harness the horses, and all our transportation was on a horse. In the summertime, it was a horse and wagon. In the wintertime, it was a sleigh, or horseback. And so, by the time I got started school, John was pretty well done. He was an old bugger. He was a very old bugger. So I don't really, my memories of John at that time are very, very indistinct. And it really started we were always told, of course, that if you wanted to succeed, you had to aspire to be as smart as John. We had two cousins, Rosa and Irene. That's what they used to tell us at Sunday school. If we could be as smart as our brother John, we'd be fine. And he was. This is true. He was. At that time, he got hired into the bank right out of school, and which was quite an accomplishment in itself at that time. Then when he joined the Air Force during the war, didn't take very long, and he was a pilot officer, and then they recognized how smart he was, and they made him an instructor and made him a flying officer. And we were always so proud when he'd come home in that uniform and just at what he was doing. Just a little aside from that, when we were living on the farm, these old Harvards would come over, training planes. And John denied this, and I don't know, I'd have to take his word for it, but planes would come over our pasture by the house so low that our holy dog would go and chase them across the field. And I don't know whether it was John or whether it was Dave Pratt or who it was, but I have a hunch it was John. And then of course when the war was over, he hung up that uniform, never thought about it anymore, and went right back to work in the bank. Made a really very successful career out of that. And He was the first one. I remember he drove home on a 47 Mercury. Was that the first car you had?
Yeah, I think so.
I remember that car coming home, and you know, I mean, Dad didn't have a car like that. That's for darn sure. He had a truck. We didn't have a car, I think, till about Dad didn't have a car, I think, about 1940, maybe, something like that. We had the first car. So we did a lot of walking, you know, and we did those things, you know, and you tell the kids, yeah, you walk through the snow and it's 40 below and all those sorts of things, and we did them, really. That's
uphill both ways, though, right?
What's going on? So we did those things. Then John and Ann got married in 1949. And then John got very sick in the early 50s. In the early 50s, when he came down with a very serious lung infection. They thought it was TB at the time, which was still. They still had 2 sanatoriums, one at Prince Albert and one at Fort Bildfell. And he spent. Fortunately, it wasn't TB. It was a type of pleurisy, wasn't it, John?
Yeah, well.
I think.
Pleurisy or whatever you want to call it.
And Ann was with Sharon at that time, just the two of them. And you were in there, what, just about a year, 9 months, 10 months?
4, hey?
Hey? How long were you in that stand at that time?
4 months.
4 months? Yeah.
That's when you always said that's not either.
So it was pretty scary. It was a pretty scary time. But back to work he went. And then Lona and I got married in 1957. And John and Ann were the first family members that Lona met. And for some reason or other, we just clicked. It was just something unusual the way we clicked, and we've had such a wonderful relationship for the last over 50 years with John and his family. It's just been something special to have a brother who is so darn nice and a friend that's even nicer, you know. But what they said about my great grandfather, and I'll say it about John. They said about him that he had a good brain. He had very sound judgment. He was a very good administrator. And he was a man that was non-judgmental. And I think that just about sums up what my brother John is. And if I had a glass of wine here, I'd offer a toast.
The most important part is
These Icelandic names, when I go back, when I'm going through that stuff, I don't even try to say them anymore. When we were very young, we could speak Icelandic, you know, but I read the names now, and some of them are, you know, this long. So if you could just join me in drinking the toast. My brother John. Grandpa.
cheers.
We got 88 toasts left.
Cheers.